time. Welcome. We're very, very privileged today to have a speaker coming to us all the way, zoomed in from South Africa, Dr. Tanya Bosch. And she is going to be talking today a little bit about her book, Social Media and Everyday Life in South Africa. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Bosch is an associate professor of media studies and production in the Center for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town, where she also holds the position of Deputy Dean for Research and Postgraduate Affairs. She teaches journalism and multimedia production, social media, radio studies, and research methods at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. She's the author of Broadcasting Democracy, Radio, and Identity in South Africa. And she is also the author of the book she'll be speaking about today, which is Social Media and Everyday Life in South Africa. This book explores how South Africans use social media apps for personal and group identity formation. Dr. Bosch has published widely in the field of radio studies in South Africa, is currently emerging as one of the few African academics publishing in the area of social media activism, with her work on hashtag Roads Must Fall and hashtag Fees Must Fall and other hashtag campaigns. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Tanya Bosch, and welcome to Temple University and Klein College of Media and Communication.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's already evening in South Africa, so I'm heading into the weekend already, but good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to be here. Patrick, thanks for inviting me. I think we should tell your students that we both went to the same graduate university, because I think that's quite interesting. We both just discovered in the context of the Zoom call that we both were in the Communication for Development Studies program at Ohio University. So that's pretty cool. I think the world is a smaller place thanks to Zoom. That's one positive that's come out of this pandemic. Is these kinds of opportunities to collaborate with colleagues, from around the world. So it's wonderful to be here. So I guess my main focus today, my talk's really informal, just to say. I think I'm suffering PowerPoint fatigue, so I haven't put together a PowerPoint presentation. There are some links I want to share with you guys, so I will put some links into the chat at some point, but my talk's really informal. If you keep your questions for the end, I don't think you'll be able to interrupt. I was about to say you can interrupt me if you wish, but keep your questions for the end. And really the general focus is about hashtag activism in South Africa and how South Africans are increasingly using social media, Twitter in particular, for political activism. But to give this some context, I just want to sort of some shameless self-promotion, since Patrick's been so kind to give me this platform. So this is my book, and what I'm speaking about today really comes from one or two chapters in this book. It's called Social Media and Everyday Life in South Africa. As he said, buy the ebook if you've got money. I won't recommend that you buy the hard copy unless you've got research funds or a credit card that your folks are paying for, but the paperback will be out in a year. So until then, the ebook is available online. So really, I started being interested in social media activism, but I really also got very fascinated into how people, South Africans in particular, use social media apps for self-presentation and for personal and group identity. So the book's got a range of chapters on things like Instagram and representation of the city. There's a chapter on Tinder and online dating. There's a chapter on self-tracking and Strava, and how people use self-tracking apps for life logging and presentation of their everyday lives. And then I'll also talk a little bit about activism, and those are the chapters that I'm going to focus on really in this presentation. So the premise of the book is really that digital platforms have become part of the production and performance of contemporary sociality. I argue that South Africans use social media apps to document life, to preserve memories. It becomes this kind of like curated stream of self-reflection and self-creation. As I'm sure you're well aware, as you're probably all social media users yourselves. And the central argument of my book is that everyday social media use can somehow become a site of democracy or a site of digital citizenship, perhaps, and that citizenship can also be practiced in spaces of leisure and popular culture outside of traditional politics. So these everyday uses of social media can become quite implicitly political, even if even if some of these apps are not designed for political communication. So the book is really concerned with the ways in which social media technology shape or perhaps even leave unchanged key aspects of social life, how the online sometimes reflect offline realities, the appropriation of technologies into people's everyday routines and the consequent digital mediation of the everyday lives of South Africans. That's sort of the main focus. And I really try to study what scholars have referred to as the so-called digital traces left by social media users. I also try to show how social media platforms impact the dynamics of offline public space. And really, this just shows that it's a global trend, as you're well aware, this sort of global trend towards the datafication of social and cultural life. It's reached South Africa, and the book is about how these apps embed themselves into our everyday routines, communications, and how in turn these mundane technologies shape everyday life. Now, before I talk about the specific examples of hashtag activism, I just wanted to I just wanted to talk a little bit about methodology and say some things about methodology. I suppose that my methodology is very much mixed media, so surveys and interviews with social media users. There's a bit of a data mining approach in my work, so I used a now defunct app called NetViz for Facebook. For Facebook, it's no longer available due to what Axel Bruns refers to as the API collapse. So apps like Facebook cutting down on people, researchers, scholars being able to access their API. You may know that Twitter has recently said they'll make their data set of their data available to researchers. I think we're still waiting to hear about the specifics of this. It's been notoriously difficult to sort of access the so-called Twitter fire hose. So for Twitter, I used a bespoke tool called Micodify for the Twitter analysis. It's freely available on GitHub, and if anyone's interested in taking a look or perhaps downloading it or reading a bit more about it, I've just put a link into the chat. Also, just to say, the methodology is very much hinged on a decolonial approach that privileges qualitative methods or mixing methods in a qualitatively driven way to confront global knowledge flows on digital experiences. And again, since you have so graciously offered me the platform, if I could just indulge in some more self-promotion, I'd like to share a recent article that's just come out, co-authored with colleagues, if anyone has an interest in this, and it's called Decolonizing Digital Media Research Methods, Positioning African Digital Experiences as Epistemic Sites of Knowledge, knowledge Production. So you can have a look at that if you're interested. But what I really want to focus on in the sort of 20 minutes or so that I have left is Twitter and hashtag activism, particularly in the South African context, because I figure with all that's happened in the global context, particularly in the United States, you've just come out of a very fascinating election period that the world has been watching on Twitter, in spaces like Twitter. You're well aware of how social media platforms can be used for political activism, but I really want to talk about South Africa in particular. I also just want to point out that I acknowledge that, while my focus is on Twitter, I think platform-specific research can be problematic. People use multiple platforms. People are, I forget the author, but, there's a scholar who's referred to this notion of people being cultural omnivores. They don't just consume one radio station, newspaper, or social media platform. They use multiple platforms which offer different affordances. We saw this in the case of Fees Must Fall, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But my focus has been quite platform specific, probably for convenience, because it has been quite easy to access certain kinds of social media data sets. There's also, so I focus on Fees Must Fall specifically, But as Patrick mentioned, I started out by looking at the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which was a movement for the removal of a colonial statue on the campus of the University of Cape Town. It also spread to Oxford University. And that was really the foundation of this Fees Must Fall movement that I'll talk about more in a minute. And just to say that there's also a chapter in the book on Zuma must fall. So after Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall, we had this proliferation of must fall hashtags in South Africa. And the Zuma Must Fall campaign was during 2015. South Africa was in political turmoil. There were a series of corruption scandals surrounding the then President Jacob Zuma, and this was a campaign calling for his resignation. The viral slogan, Zuma must fall, was used to indicate discontent with government and resignation of the president. And this was also quite interesting because here we saw a great example of what's often referred to as collective networked action. So we saw South Africans unifying across political affiliation, across class in some instances, across race. And while President Zuma resigned in 2018, we can't necessarily attribute this to the social media campaign, but it was certainly a factor in growing pressure for him to resign. So, one of the big critiques about these kinds of programs is also that the low barriers to entering and joining a movement online can often result in what's called thin civic activity. And these thin modalities of civic engagement don't necessarily lead to action that we conventionally term as impactful, but they do represent gestures that carry symbolic weight. It gives voice, it affords visibility to issues that are generally marginalized. Most of you, if this is your area of digital media is your field, you might be familiar with the scholar Zizi Papacharisi, who refers to this phenomenon as the emergence of super surfaces. She calls them as social media extends and pluralizes spaces for conversation and mobilization organically, but without direct connection to the systemic core of civic institutions. So as a result, it doesn't always lead or result in the ability to effect institutional change. So in the case of Zuma Must Fall, for example, it could be seen as a campaign aimed at organizing a series of once-off protest events, as opposed to a broader political movement. So you have these emergence of these kinds of campaigns in South Africa that really take shape on social media platforms, Twitter in particular, but they're not conventional kind of protest platforms. But let me say, I won't say too much perhaps about Fees Must Fall. I think many of you might be familiar with that movement. It really made it onto the national and onto the international, mainstream news agenda. But I think Fees Must Fall is probably the classic example of a hashtag campaign in the South African context. So these were nationwide student protests against an increase in university tuition. They became known and widely referred to simply as Fees Must Fall. That was the slogan that student activists painted on placards and banners and used, shouted in their campaign. It began at the University of Cape Town and very quickly spread to university campuses around the country. This hashtag Fees Must Fall was widely used across social media platforms, even on platforms like Facebook, that doesn't rely on the affordance of the hashtag. And we really saw the viral diffusion of this hashtag and the formation of ad hoc issue publics. Davis uses this term hashtag politics to refer to the increased role of Twitter as a political source, particularly its influence in placing issues like Fees Must Fall on agendas for national debate and deliberation. So with Fees Must Fall, there was offline political protest. There were marches, there were sit-ins, students occupied buildings, there were public mass meetings, there were incidents of so-called civil disobedience, such as setting off of fire alarms so that buildings had to be evacuated and courses couldn't be, classes couldn't be taught. Setting bins alight, that sort of thing. They were quite unique in scale and type, but what made these 2015 and also 2016 protests particularly unique in the broader context of previous student protests in the country. Remember South Africa, you know, most of you would be familiar with our apartheid history. We have a long history of protest, social protest and political protest. But what was fascinating about these student protests and also university campuses have for many years, for decades, been sites of protest, even during the apartheid years. This is, you know, university campuses are usually where these kinds of broader political movements began. But what made Fees Must Fall particularly interesting in this context was the use of social media, both for coordination, to gain public attention, and the fact that the protest action and the social media viral diffusion of this hashtag led to widespread institutional reforms. So that the big success of Fees Must Fall was a 0% fee increase. So fees were not scrapped, but there was a 0% fee increase. There have been several shifts in policy around funding of indigent and marginalized students and so on. What is also interesting about Fees Must Fall is that these protests came at a global, I think, political moment in which there was this wide acknowledgement or highlighting of so-called political apathy amongst youth. So around the world, we've seen declining participation at the polls, reduced youth voter registration. We've seen this in South Africa as well, which is hugely damaging in the South African context because we have what's referred to as a youth bulge. So we've got a very large youth population. That's been one of the factors listed for the lower numbers of something like COVID-19 in the context of the pandemic is the age range of our population. You know, we had this context where there was this highlighting of youth political apathy and reduced youth participation in mainstream party politics. And suddenly here you had this massive movement that was being entirely driven by young people. So for the first time since the advent of democracy, or since protest pre-democracy, pre-1994 during apartheid days, was probably the last time students engaged in this kind of large-scale political action. The apparently, or the so-called apathetic youth were here now engaged in political protest, very reminiscent of the notable youth protest movements of the apartheid era. So this was fascinating. Twitter in particular played a key role in the Fees Must Fall student protests as a vehicle to disseminate information, to coordinate protest activities. So tweets were used to call students to protest marches, to distribute information about protest activities. So, you know, activists would tweet that a certain building was going to be occupied at a particular time, and that information could be very quickly disseminated within the space of an hour or less minutes, you know, before the authorities could get there. It was used to facilitate online discussions about what was happening on various university campuses around the country. It was also really interesting that at the height of the protests at the University of Cape Town, university management took out an interdict to prevent activists from physically disrupting campus, and hashtag Fees Must Fall was listed in this interdict. So it was sort of obtaining an interdict against a hashtag. So potentially limiting freedom of speech, of course, but also simultaneously highlighting the importance of social media in the protests. So Twitter was used to organize, to coordinate, to recruit participants, to convey information about dates, times, and other logistical issues. It became a central source of information. You know, as academics, we would log into Twitter every morning to see, well, are we going to be teaching today? Are we going to be able to access the campus? Is the campus open or closed today? So it became quite central in that sense. More interestingly, I think, student activists and protesters used Twitter to live tweet events as they were happening. They became citizen journalists. They broke news ahead of mainstream journalists using hashtags, in particular the Fees Must Fall hashtag, to aid the visibility of these tweets. And I think it's really interesting that Twitter was also used to craft alternate narratives about the protest in opposition to mainstream media coverage. So, for example, Twitter would show images of things like police brutality. So it would shape counter narratives and frame the protests from the perspective of students. So social media, Twitter in particular, really used for the mobilization of this, what was really quite a loose social movement. You really see it as a great example of what Bennett and Segerberg call connective action. And their concept, talks about how social protest movements use digital media to enable personalized public engagement. And this is really what we saw here. Students felt personally affected by this. And you had this personalized public engagement. So the core dynamics of the protest action were shaped by users sharing personalized content via social media. So social media also played a key role in creating a space for personalized storytelling, and this probably happened much more on Facebook. So remember, this was at a time when there was the limited characters on Twitter. What is it, 140 characters? So Twitter didn't really give a lot of space for debate or discussion. It was really just sort of used as a PR tool, used for coordinating protest. I love that expression that the author Gabardo uses, where he talks about Twitter, social media, Twitter in particular, as a so-called choreography of assembly. So that's exactly what we saw happening here. I think, in my research on Fees Must Fall and Twitter, I got sort of really excited, analyzing all these tweets and the Twitter data. And it was really interesting to me, kind of a lesson as a researcher, that when I then, a year or two later, had the opportunity to actually interview student activists, a much different kind of picture began to emerge. And I began to see how, while I'd originally argued in some of my earlier work that Twitter had played this, central role in the Fees Must Fall movement, what the interview data with activists revealed was that there was a much more complex social media ecology at play here, with Twitter really used for PR, public relations, promoting the movement, getting the issues into the national agenda and into the mainstream movement, so a kind of agenda setting role. Facebook was really the space where people were really engaging and debating, and engaging in kind of deliberative dialogue and controversial dialogue, like much deeper conversation and dialogue. So Facebook, people, as one activist reflected, people turned to Facebook because of the affordances of the platform. It allowed more space for reflexive engagement. So people used their own pages and group pages to share stories, to debate, to have discussions about some of the deeper and more complex political contexts of the movement, to disseminate information as well, but really to promote conversation among their closed networks. And these posts were often made public and then shared by other people. WhatsApp was also flagged as another key tool in the protest, and this is something I haven't really researched much outside the context of Fees Must Fall. WhatsApp is becoming increasingly influential in the African political landscape, with WhatsApp groups being used also for the spread of political disinformation, but also for the formation of sort of ad hoc issue publics, people having conversations. In fact, there's a phrase that's being used across Africa, same WhatsApp group or different WhatsApp group, that really refers to people's political affiliation. So if you want to indicate that you share a kind of political vision, or if you have a similar political perspective as someone else, you would use the expression same WhatsApp group, which really sort of highlights how important WhatsApp is becoming in politics in Africa. So WhatsApp, and this is despite, or maybe I should say before the WhatsApp privacy, the most recent WhatsApp privacy issue, or I should say despite that, while Signal and Telegram are being used, WhatsApp is still quite prevalent in the African context. So WhatsApp was flagged as another key tool used in the protests, and that was primarily for internal communication and coordination by activists, and other platforms. So Google Drive, Google Docs, used to share academic literature that people were reading, and so on. So I didn't really have an opportunity to study WhatsApp at this stage, but really just wanting to flag that while I originally thought Twitter was playing this, important role, there was a much more complex and broader kind of social media ecology at play here. And you saw how WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, and traditional forms of communication kind of came into play as well. So I think I want to use the last 5 minutes perhaps just to highlight kind of some make some key concluding remarks. I think that Twitter research and social media research is always difficult, is always problematic, particularly in contexts like South Africa. We still have huge issues with access. Twitter is not a very representative platform. We do have the growth of the mobile internet, which has made internet access a lot more widespread. But smartphone penetration is still quite low. I don't have very accurate statistics, but it's something around optimistically 60-65%. Internet penetration is just over 56%, or it was just over 56% in 2019. Still quite low, probably around 60% in 2021. So I think it's quite important to flag that these movements that I'm talking about are often primarily middle-class movements, but it's the same way that middle-class engagement in dominating political narrative is often more prevalent on talk radio or even in print media. These hashtag campaigns are taking place in English. It's English dominant, which excludes a large proportion of the population. We're a country with 11 official languages. We have a massive rural-urban divide. But at the same time, with respect to Twitter in South Africa, one could argue that Twitter does represent the diversity of the political landscape in South Africa. So you really do see quite a wide representation, accurate representation of political opinion and affiliation, of race certainly, and quite often sometimes of class. There was some other work I did recently which highlights, and I'm just putting a link to that article in the chat. It highlights the role played by Black Twitter. In South Africa, it's often referred to as Sunday Twitter. So there's a lot of use of Twitter, people tweeting about live television, particularly reality television shows, which usually screen on a Sunday evening, or people tweeting about football matches, which often take place on a Sunday. This is the phenomenon we refer to as Sunday Twitter. So we do see that increasingly, and this is not in English, this is people are code switching, people are speaking in indigenous African languages, they're mixing English and other languages. And I kind of use that, as evidence to say that, it's problematic studying Twitter in the South African context. But we could argue that it's starting to become a little bit more diverse. I think the second thing to mention is also just that, by no means am I sort of highlighting social media activism as the only mechanism for protest in the South African context. I think it's just very complementary. So protest, South Africans have a wide range of protest repertoires, which began during apartheid, and those persist to the present day. Some of the things I've mentioned, earlier, certain kinds of acts of civil disobedience, for example. But I think it's really interesting that the emergence of social media tools as vehicles for the expression of these protest activities reflects the growing prevalence of hashtag activism. So this term, which refers to the increased role of social media as a tool for political organizing, and particularly its influence in placing issues on a national agenda for debate and deliberation. But you really also see social media's potential to amplify citizen views, citizen discontent, and you really see the building of horizontal connections between citizens. Also, just on that note of protest repertoires, I also just wanted to share, just for those that might have an interest in South Africa or protest, an article also co-authored with colleagues around the use of nano media in South Africa, what we refer to as nano media. to talk about how nano media, things like printing slogans on T-shirts, for example, is probably still more powerful than spaces like Twitter. I think that the use of hashtag activism in South Africa also highlights the importance of social media as a kind of gate-watching tool. So citizens often use it to rebroadcast and to amplify selected news content. So this is something that's a pattern that has really emerged in my research and which is really quite fascinating, because I think some scholars see social media as replacing mainstream news content. Political economy approaches to mainstream news media really highlight the problematic nature of that news content, especially in a South African context. So we've got lots of publications owned by very few individuals or outlets. But it's really interesting that citizens often use social media to retweet mainstream news content, which is often seen as more or most authentic. And then just really to say in conclusion, I think that this is nothing new. We are seeing this happening globally. As I said at the beginning, especially for you guys, you've just come through a fascinating election period. You've seen, perhaps in a slightly different way, you've seen this kind of citizen engagement play out in social media spaces. But I think in the South African context, what's happening here is very interesting, or particularly interesting, because we are so polarized geographically. South Africa still functions very much along old apartheid structural lines, which are largely still in place in terms of location. We had our first democratic elections in 1994, but neighborhoods, for example, are still very racial, still organized very much along race. So race and class in South Africa really converge quite strongly. We've got the urban-rural divide, we've got city and township, and those divides are often along racial lines. And what you really begin to see, I argue, in the book and in some of my other work, is that social media offers South Africans a virtual space to connect people across race and class, across these old cleavages and lines of affiliation and racial disconnect. And despite, the critiques of social media, we really start to see that it sometimes, creates quite a positive space for people to engage in real debate, not to talk only to talk at each other, but to actually listen to each other and engage in a kind of real conversation and debate. There's a chapter in the book that looks at race in particular, which if anyone has an interest in this, you might want to look at, where it shows that while conversations about race are often quite, superficial on social media, there are spaces when you do an analysis looking at keywords where people are actually having real engagement and debate across these, old apartheid cleavages. And I think that what remains to be seen in South Africa, in the South African context, is the role that disinformation might play, which might then make social media a much less, useful space for the formation of digital citizenship. And that's probably where I'm moving next in terms of my research, is to begin, and of course we don't have it to the same extent that we have seen it in the United States in your context, but we have certainly started to see, some issues around the spread of disinformation and so on in the South African context, and that I suppose is sort of a next step for me. But I think I'll stop there. I think I'm right on time, and there's some time for conversation or time for comments. Also, just to say, if there are any students in the group that have a particular interest in South Africa or working on projects related to South Africa, I'm quite happy to engage with you via email or a Zoom chat. And right at the beginning, to test the chat, I did put my email address in the chat. So feel free to pop me a line after the session if you want to engage personally. So yeah, thanks, Patrick. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tanya. What we're going to do, folks, is just look for raised hands for allowing for some from deliberation, and also I think Mia's going to open up the chat. And Tanya, thanks for that offer. I think you will get some emails, and I know there's a couple of people especially anxious to ask some questions. And let's go ahead and start off with Septime.
Thank you. So I don't know if this is relevant, but I want to try to say, Sanibona, Professor. Nijani.
You're on the wrong, you're in the wrong yeah, side of the world.
But anyway, yeah, I had the privilege of going to South Africa in 2018, especially in Gauteng. So I read the book, or I started reading the book, and I saw a paragraph in chapter 2, the one on Strava, where you talked about the uses and gratification framework and theory, and mentioned that we shouldn't be trying to apply bluntly theories like that to the African context. Rather, we should try to identify categories and ask communities and audiences if they confirm this, which is intriguing to me. It's part of what I've been thinking, not necessarily about this theory, but overall on whatever we say and discuss in the field. So I wanted to ask, what other frameworks and theories do you see not applicable to our continent? And if you are the only one in this trend? And that's the first question. The other one will be, I think you mentioned this a little bit, but I would like you to expand on the methodological or theoretical bricolage that you described in the introduction chapter of the book. Thank you.
Patrick, do you want to take a couple of questions, or do you want me to respond to Emmanuel straight away, or how do you want?
Yeah, go ahead and respond to Septim, and I think we'll just roll into the next question after that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'll try to keep my response quite short. I think have a look at the link I put, the new article that we've just written on digital methods in the African, decolonizing digital methods in the African context. But I think the short answer to your first question is just to say, I think I want to advocate for what is sometimes referred to as a contrapuntal approach, coming from a term coming from music, where you've got two melodies that interweave, to kind of form one melody. And it's really just, I guess what that means in practical terms is that I don't think I'm necessarily advocating for throwing out any particular theory. I think it's just about how theory works in local contexts, and finding how we can find multiple theories that that work in African context. So it's not a simplistic approach as saying we've got to throw out Western theories because it's not applicable in the African context. But I think my argument is more about more about the relevance of theory and thinking about how those old school theories can work, in African context, taking into account the local context and the materiality of the local context and so on. And that's something that we discuss at length in that decolonizing digital methods article. So maybe have a look at that, because I think it will really answer some of those questions. With respect to the second question about theories applicable to the continent, I really don't think that there's an answer to that question. I mean, I think that's quite a difficult question, because I think it really depends on your data set. I mean, don't forget that the role of theory is supposed to be to help us make sense of data. And so we can use lots of different kinds of theory, even if it is Western theory, if it helps us make sense of the data, So there's a lot of, we always joke in our department when we teach second years about, trying to get Habermas off the reading list, because we want to look at different alternate ways of thinking about the public sphere. But somehow we, and even in my own work, sort of return to Habermas in the public sphere, even though it's been critiqued by countless people, and there are all sorts of alternate frameworks, counter publics, Michael Warner, Nancy Fraser, etc. So I don't think there's really an answer to that. I think it's about the kind of data that you're working with. And that answer, my answer to that question relates to your comment about bricolage, because I think as a theoretical bricolier, you want to kind of think about not locking yourself into one particular theory, you know, and thinking about how using being a bricolier, using lots of different tools, lots of different theories, can actually help you. Different theory is just a lens, you know, so you've got to think about using lots of different theories as a lens through which you look at your data, you know, like those old school cameras where you could change the lens. And then at some point you might put on a lens and realize, oh, actually, this is cool. That really highlights something really fascinating about my data set, you know, and that's kind of the theory that you will go with. So I don't think there's any particular theory that is applicable to African contexts or global South research. I think it very much depends on the kind of data set that you're working with and what theory really helps illuminate or helps you understand that data better. But having said all of that, I am also very much an advocate for, you know, for this concept of bricolage, where you can use different kinds of theory, and perhaps as a methodology also use the grounded theory approach, where you're coming up with your own, you know, when you can use data and draw on theory to create your own kind of theorizations that make more sense in a global South context. So yeah, it's a bit vague, I know, but I think these questions are tricky. There aren't really any clear, straightforward answers, you know, to some of these questions.
Thank you. Fab, I think your hand flashed up did you have a question? No, okay, the mute's not working there.
Sorry, it's working now. I was just clapping.
Okay. Others? Mencia.
Yeah, Tanja, this is so great. Thanks for a great presentation. It's so interesting to think about these movements in dialogue, and I have a couple questions because, you know, we saw the same thing emerge in Chile, and actually started with high school students, and then it just mushroomed into college students and everyone protesting the privatization of higher education, which, you know, is something that I wonder all the time, how come it doesn't happen here in the US? I mean, the US, I believe, is probably the most costly higher education on the planet, and still you don't see students protesting the high cost of it. But okay, so my question is if you could give us a little bit of detail into, because sometimes when we think about South Africa, it's amazing how little we know. So in Colombia or Chile, in Latin American countries, a good internet connection that is very affordable here in the US. For example, you know, I pay about $60 for an excellent online connection, and that is probably 4 movie tickets, 4 tickets to go see films. What is the cost of an internet connection, a good internet connection in South Africa, in terms of the affordability? In Colombia, a good internet connection is 25% of the minimum salary. And so a lot of Colombians are just getting a minimum salary, and many Colombians are not even getting a minimum salary. And the same internet connection that is quite affordable here in Colombia is 1/4 of your monthly salary. So of course it totally prevents you from using internet all the time to watch YouTube videos or upload videos, or, you know, and most people are connected, but it's not the same type of connectivity that we have here. People are connected, and that means that they have prepaid phone cards and they use them mainly for WhatsApp messages and text messages, because if they download one single video, then their entire phone card of data is gone. So can you talk a little bit about that so that we know what the situation is in South Africa? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So internet access is very unaffordable in South Africa. We do not have very stable ADSL broadband connection. So most people are connected via SIM card, via some kind of mobile connection. So landlines have really become quite defunct in South Africa. I haven't had a landline for probably over a decade, not in my house. So to start with the personal, I spend 1,000 Rand a month, which is plus minus $70 for a LTE, a mobile LTE uncapped connection, which is relatively fast. So it serves me and all my Zoom and Microsoft Teams meetings and this kind of streaming. And I also have a 15-year-old in the house who is constantly on, you name it, YouTube, Amazon Premium, Netflix, Showmax, and also doing his homeschooling online at the moment. So it's quite a consistent, reliable connection. But I would be considered to be quite privileged in a South African context to have that kind of uncapped connection. So that amount of $70 per month represents something like a quarter, maybe even a third of what the government has calculated a basic food basket for a family of 4 for a month. So that's really, if you think about it in relation to what people are spending on food, that they could be spending a third of the amount of money that they're spending on food on data costs. That's very expensive. There was a survey done in our country recently which showed that people are actually spending almost as much and sometimes even more money on data than they are on food, which is actually very disturbing. So in that context of 1,000 Rand a month, also just to say that the minimum wage in South Africa is 20 Rand an hour, which means that you'd have to work for 50 hours, it would represent 50 hours of your time then to pay for that kind of internet connection. So even when people have access to mobile devices, data still becomes, quite problematic and becomes quite tricky. But most people are accessing via kind of mobile connections, SIM cards, either using their phones or using tablets. So I hope that sort of answers it a little bit. There's also been, I talked about these must-fall movements. There's also been a big data must-fall movement, which has been very unsuccessful to kind of try to reduce the cost of data. You didn't ask it as a question, Clemencia, but I think I just want to quickly just say that I think the reason that you don't see these kinds of movements in first world countries like the United States and places where higher education is also expensive is because I think movements like fees must fall are kind of just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of broader socioeconomic issues in particular countries. So South Africa is almost right up there with Brazil as being one of the, if not the most unequal society in the world. So when students complain about fees, it's not about the cost of higher education, it's about the cost of life, really. It's about a broader, and that's why Fees Must Fall was so successful, because parents came on board, ordinary people supported it. Many South Africans don't feel that they've really enjoyed the dividends of democracy. And we've got this huge social inequality. So for someone like myself as a university professor, spending what to me doesn't seem like a lot of money, 1,000 Rand, $70 a month on internet, I would be considered exceptionally privileged in this particular context to have that kind of streaming, that kind of uncapped, uninterrupted internet service that allows for this kind of, this kind of streaming. But I think, yeah, so it's about broader issues. It wasn't really, it was about the fees, but it was about much broader kind of political issues. And one of the main reasons that the movement was so successful is that the government became frightened that it was going to become a kind of almost like a civil war, because it wasn't just about fees, it was about broader inequalities in the country, and it could have easily become this huge groundswell of campaigning against government and campaigning against inequality. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Clemencia, for that question, and Tanya for the response. We've got a number of other hands up. Ellen, go ahead and jump in.
Hi, Tanya. My name's Ellen. So happy to come to this talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I am really interested in your work into Instagram. I know it's one of your chapters. I was curious, in my experience, finding research about digital activism on Instagram has been difficult. I feel like Twitter and WhatsApp are much more talked about, Facebook too. So I guess question one is, I'm curious, why do you think that is, scholarship-wise, why there's less on Instagram? And particularly, what is it about Instagram that is different than Twitter or Facebook with regard to, these forming of networked publics? And my other question is not related to Instagram, it's just general. So, there's a lot of people on this call who are, early scholars of digital media. And I always like to ask, if there's anything that you could tell your younger self doing the work that you're doing, what would you say to your younger self doing digital activist research? What advice would you give younger you that you now have better perspective? Like what's most important? You can answer that open forum, I guess. But yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Thanks for the questions. I'll answer the second one first. I was never very good at math. Go figure, PhD in the humanities. I mean, yay, right? Okay, yeah, humanities. So I was always just really, I spent a lot of time trying to learn how to code, because I always thought it was very cool when I went to some of these international conferences where you say, oh, I really want to know such and such on Twitter, and then some person smarter than you quickly writes a piece of code and they can just do it. And I always really wanted to do that, and I spent a lot of time trying to do that. And a lot of media studies has become very much like computational methods. But so in relation to that second question, I think the one thing I've learned is that that's really not worth the time if you're not a math geek like me, or if that's just not your thing. And I think what's really most important is the theory. It's knowing how to ask the right questions. It's easy to pay someone or to bribe a friend to write a piece of code for you. So don't worry about not being able to really engage with the computational methods, because they change constantly. If you can't program in R, I saw that. If you can't program in R, or you don't know how to, if you think Python is a snake, and not a piece of computer software, that's okay. I think it's much more valuable to actually know the right questions to ask and to have a good understanding of theory than it is to be able to do that. You can just pay someone. If you have money, you can pay someone. You can ask a friend to do that. So I would tell the younger me not to be so anxious about not knowing how to do stuff like that. In terms of the first question, I think the big limitation with Instagram is, again, access to Instagram's API. So there's been a big clampdown. It's been traditionally easier to collect data from platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Instagram is also much more visual, so that's a whole different kind of area of visual analysis that I think has meant that researchers haven't really engaged so much with Instagram. So it's more really about data collection. It's much harder to collect data in an organized way on Instagram than it is on Twitter, even though Twitter is not necessarily organized, because if you do a search for a hashtag, you don't necessarily get all the You won't necessarily get all the tweets, you know, as you know, but it still appears in a much more organized. There are so many open source platforms that will pull tweets into a CSV file for you and allow you to analyze it in that way. So the main thing is Instagram has not given access to the API. I also think that a lot of this kind of political activism that you're talking about on Instagram is happening in Instagram stories. And those are transient, they disappear within 24 hours. So how do we access, how do we access those? Unlike something like Twitter or even Facebook, where you can develop a researcher account, Instagram is very much just dependent on who you follow, your own personal network on Instagram. So that's another challenge. But I would love to do more work on Instagram. You know, during your election, my son kept engaging me. He wanted to have these, my 15-year-old wanted to have these conversations with me about, Mom, do you really think that Trump is gonna, not be president? Or, who do you think is going to win the election? Or what do you think is gonna happen? Or have you seen what's happening in America? Oh my God, it's crazy. And I, sort of wondering, where do you get this information? And he says, oh, Instagram, So for kids that age, Instagram is increased because of its visual nature. It's really becoming a critical platform for the dissemination of political information, but it's just really practically very difficult to study. So I think people like us must start to try to find ways to research Instagram. And my work on Instagram was really very rudimentary. It was about representation of the city, looking at hashtags, the hashtag Cape Town specifically, and it was just very rudimentary, like picking the first 100 images that come up when you search for a particular, for images tagged with particular hashtags. So very super basic. You obviously miss a lot of data. And I think researching Instagram stories is the main challenge, because that's really where the real stuff is happening, not in posts. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you, Tanya. Karen Turner, go ahead and jump in.
Okay, thank you. Tanya, I've enjoyed this so much, and your accent is having me miss South Africa. I've been taking groups of Klein students to South Africa since 2013, so this has been a pleasure. And I want to thank you too for clarifying about the hashtag protests being a middle class movement in English. And so my question to you has to do with, I usually take groups of students to Bush Radio in Cape Town. And I'm curious, are you seeing that where those who live in the townships who don't have the same type of connectivity, that the impact of community radio and talk radio really steps in and fills their void for that type of political activism? I know during apartheid, radio was so key. And since there are still issues of connectivity, is that where they have to go to do their political activism, or are you seeing something different?
That's a really great question, and I'm a huge fan of community radio, and my PhD thesis, Karen, is on Bush radio specifically. So that's a wonderful question. That's a really difficult question, though, because in theory, that's the role that community radio should be playing, but community radio at the moment is in crisis in South Africa because of lack of funding. There's a lack of political will from government to invest in these stations. They've got a high staff turnover. They're still dependent very much on volunteers. So in principle, community stations, and not all of them, Bush Radio in particular, has a very strong political orientation to serve exactly that kind of mandate that you just outlined. But they find it very difficult to really do that, because they don't have enough funding to keep a high quality of programming turning over. And so people are turning to entertainment radio. They listen to music radio stations more and more, and less to community radio, to community radio stations. Tabloid newspapers for that demographic that you're talking about, tabloid newspapers are becoming a key platform as well. And of course, those are problematic. So tabloid newspapers, not in terms of size, but in terms of the content. So sort of sensationalist, highly personalized sensationalist media coverage. You know, so yeah, so it's a bit sad for me to see. So in theory, community radio should be doing this, but the short answer is that I think they're very much limited by resources, and so this isn't really happening for that demographic, for, you know, that you know, working class people, a lower socioeconomic demographic that doesn't have access to the internet and this kind of high level of connectivity to allow you to have access. So it's really, and what that means is that you have large sections of the community of South Africa that are really kind of cut off from news and political debate. You know, it doesn't, you know, you've got these pockets of society that are completely cut off in many ways, that are living on the margins in all ways, particularly when it comes to access to news and debate. And I suppose, you know, as I'm talking, I'm thinking that I suppose the one way that people like that do access news is old school television news. So you still have communal practices. There's a television in a shabin, which is a tavern, like a bar, local bar that's in someone's backyard, and people go there to watch things like football matches, or when there's a president's address, like during COVID-19, our president addresses us, or, you know, every few weeks, people would gather in groups, and you've still got those communal television watching practices. So sadly and ironically, probably more television and tabloid newspapers over community radio.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Vasek, you've had your hand up for a long time. I want to get you in.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Professor. It's a great work, and it makes sense for me right now, especially as a student protester who is like trying to do as much as she can for protests in Bulge in Turkey these days. So my question kind of extends from Professor Clemencia's question on access, but it's more about how your interviews with the students went, how you observed their reactions to Twitter. So you said it's a polarized population, and how much do you think the students were aware that the people who were against the protest, who wouldn't be supportive of the protest, had access to Twitter? Did you think that they felt safe being like carrying their protests to social media mediums, let's say, platforms?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's been a concern of protesters around the world. So South Africa is a relatively free media environment. We're probably one of the few African countries that hasn't experienced like internet shutdowns, for example. So I think in general, students felt quite free, but having said that, Fees Must Fall was what was referred to as like a flat leadership structure. It wasn't easy to identify who the so-called ringleaders were. And I think that was a deliberate strategy because of exactly the question that you're asking. It protected the kind of leadership. There was also a lot of tweeting from generic accounts, from the Rhodes Must Fall account, from the Fees Must Fall, social media account. So you didn't always know you didn't always know the people, the individuals behind it. And the reason my research played out in this way is that it wasn't possible to do these interviews when I first published the Twitter work, because people were afraid still to speak out. I think they were worried about losing scholarships or losing their place at the university, or being prosecuted maybe for some of the criminal protest acts that took place, stuff like that. So yes, there was some fear, but Fees Must Fall was very much a flat leadership structure, where it was very difficult to see on social media who the actual instigators were always. You haven't really asked it directly, but I think what also emerges, for me at least, when you ask your question, is that we shouldn't see protest movements always in such a romantic way, So yes, it was successful and it was a great movement, but there was also a lot of racism, a lot of chauvinism, a lot of able-bodiedism, discrimination against people with certain sexual orientations. There were lots of issues like that within the Fees Must Fall movement. So people constantly fighting to not have male activists, voice certain kinds of narratives or certain kinds of toxic masculinity. there was a lot of, that the movement itself was hugely divided along lines. It wasn't always a unified movement, because the movement became quite representative of these kinds of crises in the broader South African society, especially when it came to issues around leadership, who speaks, who decides, who makes decisions. It was also very controversial for being quite anti-white, just to sort of use that term in inverted commas. There often wasn't a lot of space for genuine debate around race. There was a section of the movement that was very pro-Black consciousness, and some very controversial moments where, like in meetings, white student activists were asked to leave the room, for example, or white professors that were allying with students were asked to leave the room. So lots of debate, and so the movement itself was actually really quite fragmented. But the short answer is really just it was a flat leadership structure, so quite difficult to see who was at the, it emerged later, very key particular individuals, but that wasn't always clear on social media that these were the guys kind of running the show. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that question. And Tanya, if you can stick around a little bit, we have a few more questions.
Oh,
we are out of time, and I know some of you are trying to roll out. I want to thank you for coming, but I do think there's some interest in keeping this rolling. So Professor Bosch, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And feel free, if you've got another class to go to exit. I won't feel, it's not like in real life where if someone leaves and the door bangs and you keep checking. So it's quite unobtrusive on Zoom. So don't feel embarrassed if you need to duck out. And thanks for coming.
Thank you. Kiana, Alexis.
Hi, it's a pretty brief question, and it kind of touched on different areas that you were speaking about, but I did just want to see your perspective and if you did find anything concerning censorship. So how do you find censorship in Africa on social media platforms in comparison to other countries that are more strict or more free or liberal? Like, where do you find it on that spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks, Kiana. I'm not sure about how to put it on the spectrum. I think on the surface, in terms of censorship and freedom of speech, we are probably one of the most open countries, both in terms of what's possible and in terms of legislation, with restrictive government policies, for example, around internet access. It's not like in Zimbabwe, where if you criticize the president on Twitter, you might actually get arrested as a journalist. So we haven't had arrests of journalists. We haven't had shutdowns, internet shutdowns. It's quite free in that sense. But having said that, I think you often on social media do see a kind of spiral of silence approach, So you do have, I know that Axel Bruns in his latest book said that echo chambers don't exist or filter bubbles don't really exist. But I think you do begin to see that, because I think you have a kind of peer pressure. People are quite afraid to speak up with controversial or with conservative political views, at least on social media. So that really happens in very tiny pockets. So not censorship in the traditional sense. We're not having journalists arrested because of what they've tweeted or that sort of thing. But I do think, like everywhere else, you probably really have a core group of people that kind of controls the debate or controls the narrative, and alternate political views or non-mainstream views or conservative views are very quickly shut down in online spaces. They're not tolerated. People are afraid to express controversial political views. So not quite censorship, but you certainly do have, that makes it not really so much an open space. It's interesting because I think on Twitter people do often post as though it's anonymous, but of course it's not. So I think there is an element of fear. In the South African context, race has particularly come to the forefront. So people have tweeted like really seriously racist comments and have suffered very real life repercussions as a result of it. So there's been a kind of, what should I call it, like social media vigilantism, where people rally against racists, let's say, online, and people like that suffer real world consequences, like a fine from the South African Human Rights Commission or losing your job because you said something derogatory about Black people in a tweet, you know, stuff like that. So I wouldn't call that censorship, but yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
not completely free. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Tanja, I wonder if I can ask a question.
Yeah.
Given the focus on social media and activism, I wonder to what extent you've looked at it sort of moving into the realm of problem solving. For instance, have you looked at all or with colleagues at the water crisis and how social media was used to respond to that, and how maybe activists then were turned into that sort of existing pool, and how they responded to what has been, particularly for, I think, South Africa, but Cape Town in particular, an ongoing crisis with water?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Patrick. I haven't looked at it per se personally, but I did have a group of students a year or two ago that did a social media project looking specifically at the drought in Cape Town, and tweets around that. But there was nothing super interesting. It was really just that social media is used, again, as a kind of PR tool. So raising awareness, information sharing. So quite as, I wouldn't call it really problem solving, but really just, you know, social media as a space to get the word out, you know, to get people, you know, to campaign, to get people to save water in particular ways that we were asked to do that. So not really deep conversations around environmentalism, you know, so it wasn't really deep engagement around, you know, global warming, climate change, the environment, the broader issues around something like a drought, but more that Twitter was used as a kind of PR space to raise awareness, to circulate messages about what people were supposed to do to save water, yeah, that sort of thing. So Twitter in particular really plays that role as a kind of PR space, get mainstream media's attention, get the word out, more that than real engagement and conversation.
Yeah, that's somewhat surprising, and to the extent that it's the finding is what was not there, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Thank you. Josh, go ahead and jump in.
Good morning. Thank you for the talk. This has been super interesting. A question I have, I try not to take for granted the fact that from our context in America that Facebook, Google, and Twitter, they're all American-owned companies. And I'm kind of curious from positions of like social media engagement and users outside of the US context, what the perception of these companies are, like their willingness to either open up or shut down the free flow of communication. And just kind of like a little thing attached to that, I think that in the US we learned a lot from the Hong Kong protests throughout the year through social media. I was curious if with the George Floyd protest that went on in June, from an outside the US perspective, what that looked like, what social media was being generated in the US context and how that was received. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Great questions. For a minute, I thought it was a virtual background, but you're actually in a radio studio, which is pretty cool. Nice T-shirt also. So just two quick things. I think there's, you know, a real gap for research around the kind of algorithmic bias and ownership and control of these kinds of platforms. But in a practical sense, honestly, no one really thinks about it. You know, people roll out of bed in the morning and look at their Facebook, or, you know, there's a widespread use of these platforms by people without much thought for kind of ownership and control and what it means to give up all of your data to Facebook. You know, we had a big sort of knee-jerk reaction to WhatsApp recently when they made some changes to their privacy policy, and everyone just said, well, it's too much effort. All the issues with Telegram, it's just too much effort to switch platforms. We're all on WhatsApp anyway. Facebook, it's fine, you know. Facebook has all of our data anyway. So there isn't really much. I guess the answer is there isn't really much of a critical engagement with these platforms. They've really just become part of people's everyday media use. You know, when the president addresses us, it's much easier for me just to watch it happen on Twitter because he talks really slowly and sometimes you miss the gist of it, or you miss, it's summarized, I instead of watching it on television, I just watch it as I find a good journalist, and as they're live tweeting it, I watch it on Twitter. So the use of those kinds of platforms is really quite uncritical, I think, in an African context. People are using it to engage. I post on Instagram every day, stuff around sports and my hiking, and and I'm a scholar. I know about the problematic nature of these platforms, but yet it's sort of a part of kind of everyday life. It's kind of for play. And then just to say, there was a huge swell of support on social media, on Black Twitter in South Africa around the time of the George Floyd and similar incidents in the United States. And it was really used to flag issues around racial injustice in South Africa. So South Africans, especially on social media, used it as a springboard to have conversations about racial inequality and racial justice, social justice, in the South African context. So the world is really a small place. It's like the ripple effect. Something little happens, in one part of the world, and it kind of has an impact because of social media. It spreads so quickly, and it really has a huge impact, everywhere else. And it's often taken up in kind of local ways to fight kind of local struggles. So yeah, well, all eyes are on America at the moment. So I think there's a lot of interest in what's happening in American politics, probably more so than what's happening in Europe, for example. But there are also interesting things happening politically with the growth of the far right and so on. But I think there's still that cultural dominance of US politics, and it's followed in our everyday news here. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank Professor Bosch for joining us today, giving us some extra time. It's a great talk, and I know there's a number of folks that were here and still are, some who are here, who will probably be following up with you, Tanya. And I want to thank all of you for coming again and being part of this. So have a great Friday.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great Friday. Enjoy the rest of your day. It was wonderful to meet all of you. Thanks for the questions, and I'll definitely respond to your emails. And I could also, I don't use Twitter much, but maybe I'll just, I'll put my Twitter handle in here as well before we go, if I can. Let me just see.